Hey, what's up everybody? Seiji here, founder of the School of Evolutionary Herbalism. And one of the things that I talk a lot about on this channel is, the importance of energetics and constitutions in clinical herbalism. This is one of the attributes of traditional systems of medicine all across the world that we see really at their root in their way of understanding the uniqueness of a person and the specific properties of medicinal plants. And that's kind of one of the attributes in, I guess, our more modern scientific era, so to speak, that oftentimes gets overlooked, right? We overlook the constitution of a person and kind of tunnel in on the name of the disease, or we forget the energetics of an herb and tunnel in on what kinds of diseases they're used for, or symptoms they're used for, or what kind of chemistry they have in them. But really, this integration of constitutions and energetics, I believe, is critically important for the modern herbalist to understand and also integrate into our scientific understanding of both people and plants. And so in this week's post, I answered a question from a student regarding some of the differentials between hot and cold. This is one of our primary elements of understanding the energetics or constitution of a person is temperature, right? Whether someone runs really hot or runs really cold. But sometimes it can be a little confusing for people in terms of how do you actually assess that? What are the core determining factors that you're looking at in a person to be able to tell whether they're hot or cold, either constitutionally or in their current symptomatic picture. So that's what I cover in this week's post. It's super, super important to understand this dynamic with every person that you work with. And so here it is, and I hope you learned something good from it. Thanks so much and take care. Our first question is coming from Janine, who's in the Vitalist Herbal Practitioner Program. And Janine is asking, I've always thought of myself as cold and dry, but listening to your explanation of cold and hot from a more energetic standpoint, I'm actually thinking that I lean more towards hot these days and perhaps have all along. I'm wondering if you have any good resources for tests or quizzes or evaluations that one can complete to better identify whether they are cold or hot, as it doesn't seem quite as obvious for my own constitution as it once was. Great question, Janine. So I'm going to kind of whittle that question down to basically what are some of the core evaluation criteria for how to assess and differentiate the temperature energetic pattern and the differences between hot and cold. So what are some of the main ways that you see heat and cold manifest within a person? And that can be either constitutionally speaking, or that can be from more of a pathology perspective. What are some signs and symptoms of cold and heat? Excuse me. So when, this is a really, really important factor to consider whenever we're working with a person, energetics of a person, their tissue states and things like that. Really, really important because it allows you to get more specific with your remedy selection. So you're not just choosing herbs based on the condition or the symptom, but you're able to get a little more specific into the ecological state of the tissues that is then giving rise to that symptom or that condition. And temperature is really, really important. So I think what I would like to do here is just talk about cold and hot and look at it from the orientation. We'll start off talking about constitutional dynamics and then dig into a little bit more detail on kind of main patterns or signs and symptoms that you might look for, maybe some examples of some specific kinds of symptoms that you might see there. So let's start off talking about heat. I think before I actually jump into that, I think what's really important to understand about energetics is that this is how nature functions, right? Everything in nature is based on energetics. I think, and it's very intuitive. Like these are things that we experience every single day, right? I actually think, I kind of joke around, but it's kind of true. It's like, I think that's why people talk about the weather so much. Right? Have you ever noticed that? Like when people don't really know what to say, they're like, oh, it's pretty hot today, or boy, it's really cold today, or for sure is dry out there, or it's not rain, it's still raining. It's like and what is that? That's hot, cold, wet, and dry, right? That's the way we always talk about that. And so I always like to encourage my students to really remember that and to really pay attention to nature and come to an understanding of these energetic patterns, not just through what you read in the books, but also just paying attention to the seasons, paying attention to the weather, paying attention to different ecosystems, and then paying attention to how those different states of nature change your internal state, right? Like, how do you feel when you're in Phoenix, Arizona, and it's 110 degrees outside? How do you feel and when it's January and you're in the far north and it's really cold? Like, pay attention to what goes on in your body, even in your mind too, because that's all the language of energetics. Okay, so with that, let's talk about heat. So from a constitutional perspective, when we're looking at heat patterns or people that tend to be more prone to heat, in the Ayurvedic orientation, this would be considered the Pitta dosha. So that dosha is associated with both the fire and water elements. A lot of people really focus on the fire aspect of Pitta, but forget that there's actually the water element with this constitution as well. Specifically in the form of oils, like Pitta tends to get very oily in their expression. Now, Pitta people tend to be kind of more of a medium build. They tend to have more of a muscular, the muscles tend to be the more predominant tissue type that you see with your eyes, whereas Kapha tends to be more adipose tissue, and Vata tends to be more connective tissue in terms of kind of what you see. So Pittas tend to be more medium build, muscular, fiery, driven, extroverted, strong personalities. So just a little bit, obviously there's a lot more to Pitta, but just a little bit there. From a medical astrology perspective, heat, we see the sun and Mars tend to be the most heat generating. A good way to kind of see the difference between the two is that the sun generally is warm, whereas Mars is hot. Mars tends to be more pathological heat, whereas the sun generally isn't creating heat to the point of it really creating physical problems in the body. That usually is under the dominion of Mars. And of course, our fire signs of the zodiac tend to be more prone to heat patterns: Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. Now, that doesn't mean if your sun sign is Leo, Aries, or Sagittarius that you're going to be innately a hot person. There's a lot of different, medical astrology is far beyond just what your sun sign is, so it's really important to remember that. I get asked that all the time, learning about medical astrology and constitution. Well, I'm a this sign and I don't have any of those problems, or I don't look like that. It's like, well, it's much that's much more involved than just what the sun sign is. But those are some of the indicators of heat in medical astrology. And when we're looking at the physiomedicalist, this is the heat excitation tissue state, is the main tissue state attributed to heat, obviously, or kind of an excess of yang in Chinese medicine. So how do you tell heat, right? Well, generally speaking, the kind of very general signs and symptoms, we'll see redness to the skin, red flushed skin, irritations, inflammations. These are all heat signs. Pain that's sharp in quality. It's like a sharp, penetrating, stinging, irritable type pain. Heat tends to be hypersensitive. This is one of the factors of the excitation tissue state is that the tissues become very hypersensitive and in that way also hyperreactive to things. So they tend to be easily aggravated or easily inflamed, very, very sensitive. A good example of that is, when people, for example, have a lot of heat in the respiratory system and they go to take a breath and it's like it hurts to take a deep breath, or they take a deep breath and it kind of irritates the respiratory tissue and then they start coughing a bunch. Or for example, in the case of, say, a urinary tract infection. So when they go to urinate, there's going to be a lot of hot, sharp, burning pain upon urination. These are very clear indicators of heat. Another clear indicator heat is a very common symptom would be something like reflux, right? Acid reflux, where you get this rising, hot, burning pain in the stomach rising up. And I think that's a key factor to consider with heat patterns in general, right? Like, look at nature, look at a fire. How is a fire in nature? Well, a fire radiates heat up and out, right? The smoke rises, the light, everything is radiating and moving upwards and outwards. And so we oftentimes see that with people, right? That their energy tends to move up and out. Even emotionally, they might have that anger or irritability or frustration, right? Those kind of qualities that boom, like explode outwards. And, even things like sweating, people that sweat excessively, that is going to be a heat pattern. Even very simple dynamics like symptoms that are aggravated by hot, spicy foods or very hot drinks, just like hot coffee or hot tea, right? Hot, spicy foods, and aversion to hot weather. So things that are, the people that go outside and they're just like, oh, I can't be in this heat, and it makes them really kind of agitated or frustrated. These are people that usually tend to be more prone to heat patterns. So just thinking of symptoms, or when their symptoms are either provoked or palliated, right? If it's provoked by heat, and that can be either like temperature heat or like spicy heat in terms of food and herbs, that's going to be a pretty clear indication of heat. And if it's palliated by cold, like that pain feels better with ice, whereas if you put a hot pack on it, that makes it feel worse. That's a clear indication there. Another factor that can be helpful is a better or worse with movement. This is oftentimes a good pain indicator, or kind of when you're working with someone that has physical pain, this is a good way of deciphering what type of pain it is in terms of hot, cold, wet, and dry. And so this is better or worse with movement. And so pain that tends to be aggravated by movement, which usually is I wake up in the morning, I feel pretty good, and then as I'm going about my day and I'm moving around and I'm doing things, the pain gradually increases. That's usually an indication that there's more heat and agitation present in the tissues, and it's better with stillness and rest. Conversely, sometimes people have pain that's worse in the morning. They wake up and they're all stiff and sore and everything aches, and they have that pain, and then they start moving around, the blood starts flowing, their joints are moving, and as that movement is heat, right? Generates heat. And then as they move, the pain subsides. That's going to be more of a cold type pain, generally speaking. So that's another really helpful differential there. Other factors for heat. So looking at the tongue, generally the heat signs on the tongue, you're going to see redness on the tongue body. So the actual body of the tongue will have a red color. Generally speaking, the deeper and darker the red, the deeper the heat has penetrated into the tissues. Granted, a light pink to carmine color of the tongue is considered a healthy tongue. But so we're really looking for kind of darker redness coloration to the tongue. Sometimes you'll see little, I always call them strawberry spots. They're kind of, and you oftentimes see them on the tip of the tongue, like those little red dots on the tongue that kind of remind me of the little dots on a strawberry. That's a good indication for heat. If there is a coating on the tongue, usually if that coating has a yellowish coloration to it, granted, it's always good to make sure someone hasn't drank a big cup of coffee right before you look at their tongue, because that will discolor the tongue. But if you do see yellow coloration on the tongue coating, that usually indicates heat. And then a general pattern that we see for more pitta type constitutions is what Matthew Wood always refers to as the flame-shaped tongue. This is a tongue that kind of comes to a very sharp tip, right? It's not really broad and wide or thick. It's more sharp in its shape and contour. So those are some factors that you can see on the tongue. Oftentimes, if there's heat with dryness, you'll see cracking on the tongue, and then redness within those cracks. That's usually a good indication of dryness coupled with heat, and whether that's the dryness is caused by the heat or the heat is caused by the dryness is different from case to case, but that's another something that you can look for on the tongue. Heat signs in the pulse. Generally speaking, oftentimes heat is working through the blood. And, from a traditional perspective, we see that the heart and the cardiovascular system is governed by the fire element. It's under the dominion of the Leo sign of the zodiac. Leo rules the heart and the circulatory system kind of as a whole, along with the sun. And so when there's a lot of heat, we oftentimes see it very clearly manifested in how the blood's moving. And oftentimes we see a lot of movement of the blood, and oftentimes we see an elevated heart rate. So, and this is very shown very clearly in a fever. I think a fever is really a picture-perfect example of seeing what heat patterns look like in a person, right? They're sweating and they get the red skin and their aversion to warm things. And oftentimes if you feel the pulse, it will be very rapid, right? So the pulse is rapid. It's also kind of pushing to the surface. A hot pulse, usually you don't have to dig around to find it, right? It should be very close to the surface and pretty easy to find, and oftentimes it's pretty rapid, or they might call that a superficial pulse. So that is showing the blood pushing out to the surface, the heat driving out to the surface, oftentimes trying to open the pores of the skin to relieve that internal heat through sweating. So these are some of the dynamics that we can look at in terms of deciphering the heat pattern in a person. Now, cold is the 180-degree opposite, basically, of everything I just said, right? Because these are oppositions. So constitutionally, now in Ayurveda, we see two constitutions have cold in common. One, Kapha tends to be cold, but Kapha is more thick, heavy, damp and cold and heavy, whereas Vata tends to be cold but with dryness and lightness. So one tends to be more stuck and stagnant, right? Kapha tends to be more stuck, stagnant, dampness coupled with cold, whereas Vata tends to be more kind of tense and constricted and more, not so much working through fluids like Kapha, but more like the nerves is a really central area that Vata moves through. So both of these constitutions can be cold. But one thing that we see constitutionally pretty much universal with cold is paleness, right? Paleness on the skin. Oftentimes you'll feel, they'll have cold hands and feet, very common complaint with cold patterns, cold hands and feet, paleness of the skin. There's one way that you can kind of see and decipher a difference in cold with specifically cold extremities, where you feel down the arm of a person, and if it gradually gets cooler and cooler and cooler as you go down the arm, and you get to the tips of the fingers and they're cold, that indicates kind of this lack of heat in the core, right? So we have this fire, the alchemical furnace in our gut that is radiating heat out to the periphery. If that fire is diminished, it's gradually going to get colder the further away you get from it, right? Just like a fire, right? You stand up close to the fire, it's hot. The further you get away from it, it cools down. So that can be one dynamic with cold hands and feet. The other is if you're feeling down the arm and it's like consistent, like warm, 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 and then all of a sudden cold, right? It's like all the same temperature, and then suddenly there's this sharp transition to cold. That usually indicates constriction or tension, right? That there's constriction in the neuromuscular junction of the blood vessels that's constricting the blood flow at a very particular point. I always like to think of, watering a garden, and, the water's flowing through the hose and everything's flowing well. But then there's a kink, right? Well, the water flows all the way up to the kink just fine. It's just after that, it doesn't. So that's kind of what that pattern of cold hands and feet is like. It's not necessarily that there's a lack of heat, right? It's more that there's a kink in the hose that's preventing that heat from reaching all the way out to the periphery, okay? So these are some of our big picture patterns of cold. From the physiomedicalist perspective, this would be called the cold depression tissue state. And similar to, and not similar, actually opposite to heat excitation, right? Excitation, the tissues are overstimulated, oversensitive, right? There's too much activity going on there. Well, cold depression is the opposite. It's a lack of stimulation. The tissue is depressed in its functioning. So I know these are like more psychological terms, like being excited or being depressed. But I always like to say, think of a little child on their birthday or Christmas morning, and they're so excited and there's so much energy and they're running around and they're over here and they're over there and they're like this, all this energy, too much, right? But then think of how you feel when you're depressed. It's just like, oh, everything is awful and terrible, and I can't get out of bed, and I don't want to do anything, and I don't want to do anything. Well, think of what happens if your large intestine says, I don't want to do anything. Or your liver is like, I don't really feel like doing my job today, right? Not good. So it's a lack of stimulation. So when a organ or tissue becomes depressed or cold, that it is hypofunctioning. It's lowered in its metabolism. It's lowered in fulfilling its physiological role. Okay, so that's a really important factor to think about. Like cold, it's like we tend to think of hot and cold in terms of degrees on a thermometer, but that's a very linear way of thinking about it. I think a more important way to think about the effects of hot and cold on the human organism is to also look at what does cold and heat do to us, right? Heat expands and radiates. Well, cold contracts. Think of how you feel when you're cold. You kind of huddle in on yourself. Everything closes in because you're trying to preserve that body heat, right? So cold contracts in, and it pulls the vital force down and in. So these are some ways you can consider that. Blood flow is really important here. Again, so with heat, we kind of have like too much blood, too much fullness. And with cold, it's a lack of blood, a lack of circulation. So that's why we see pale skin. That's why we see cold hands and feet are very common. So for example, cold digestion, right? This is a really common pattern that we see these days. Cold depression in the digestive system. We're seeing The digestive organs are not fulfilling their physiological function up to par. So we see a lack of stimulation, a lack of secretion. Maybe the gallbladder isn't secreting bile as effectively. Maybe the liver isn't producing enough bile. Maybe peristalsis is not, those muscular contractions aren't occurring as efficiently and effectively as they could be. And lo and behold, we see things like constipation, right? Could be associated with cold digestion. So that's one really pretty straightforward, simple example of how the cold depression tissue state can manifest within the body. And I think really the best way to differentiate heat from cold is just looking at those kind of general signs and symptoms, right? So with cold, we're also going to see, a preference for hot food, hot drinks. We're going to see an aversion to icy, cold, frozen type foods. They can be oftentimes aggravating. We can see on the tongue signs of cold. So again, paleness. So a pale tongue, oftentimes we'll see the coating on the tongue has more of a white coloration, and it is common for there to be perhaps a thicker coating, especially if there's dampness present, for there to be a thick white coat on the tongue that indicates cold, usually coupled with dampness. But pale tongue, wide tongue, sometimes thicker, but it's really that paleness and that white coloration that's pretty clear indicator for cold. And very opposite to the heat excitation tissue state, in the pulse, the cold pulse is going to be deeper, it's going to be lower, it's going to be hidden and more difficult to find. Whereas hot, it's like pushing up against your finger and hammering up against it, right? The cold pulse, because the circulation is pooled in, right? Everything's down and in. So it might be deeper, it might be more difficult to find, and it's typically going to be a little slower and a little more languid. So instead of the like wham, 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 wham of heat, it's going to be like boom, boom, boom. A little more steady, a little more rounded, not quite so sharp in terms of its feeling against the finger. So those are some general things to consider there with the cold pulse. Of course, there's a lot of different dynamics around the pulse, but I think that's the most simple way to explain it, to just kind of be aware of that. And that is what I got for you in terms of some differentials to consider when you're looking at hot versus cold. Again, this is should be very intuitive. I think a lot of people tend to overthink this a little too much and get pretty intellectual about it. And while it's good to have an understanding of, some of the signs and symptoms, I think it's also like we all know what heat feels like. We all know what cold feels like. We all know what it feels like to be excited. We all know what it feels like. Well, maybe not all of us, but most people, I think, have experienced a little bit of depression or melancholy from time to time. And so paying attention to nature, I just want to bring it back to that, because I think that is one of the most important ways to really understand energetics. The human body is an ecosystem. It is a mirror of the natural world. And so I always say a good herbalist is first and foremost and forever a student of nature. And so the more that you can understand the patterns of hot and cold and in nature, the more you'll be able to just recognize it within a human body pretty easily. So that is what I got for you here in terms of heat and cold. Thanks so much for the question, Janine, and I hope that answers your question well.